Good afternoon and welcome to Detroit Public Library's virtual office series. My name is Christine Peel and I, alongside my co-chair, Tanika Chapman-Mills, and our colleague Tracy Massey, will be your hosts for this program. Today is a webinar format and we will be reading questions from the chat. So the conversation will be between the two presenters, and then if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're also asking that you, if you're interested in buying the book, that you support local businesses, and the book is available for purchase at Source Booksellers. This afternoon, we are welcoming Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, who today will be in conversation with historian Jamon Jordan, discussing her new and very timely book on Juneteenth. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard. Gordon-Reed is the winner of 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 and the National Book Award in 2008 for the Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family. Jamon Jordan is an educator, writer, and historian who has been a researcher of African and African American history for more than 20 years. He is the founder and CEO of Black Scroll Network History and Tours in Detroit, where he leads tours and presentations on African American history in the city of Detroit and in Michigan and sometimes across the country. So, Jamon, let's get started with the program. I'm gonna turn my camera off and I'm going to let you guys have a nice conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Detroit Public Library. And thank you, everybody who tuned in today to this webinar on Juneteenth. I mean, there's so many activities that you could be doing on Juneteenth, so I'm glad that you're here to find out about this wonderful book. Here it is, On Juneteenth, by Annette Gordon-Reed. And so I've jumped into it. I haven't completed it, but I jumped into it a few days ago when I got the book. And we're going to be talking about it. But what we want is that everybody read this book. So we want to give you some of the information that is very important in the book, but we are not going to just read the whole book out to you. So that's not what we're going to do. But the first thing, of course, we want to do is we want to identify Juneteenth. This date, June 19th, 1865. What is the importance of this date? What happened? Why is this date even a part of our national memory right now?
Well, first, I'd like to say how happy I am to be here. I love public libraries, and I like to do events in public libraries. I spent my childhood growing up in a small town. The thing to do, one of the few things to do, was to go to the public library, and so I always try to support them whenever I can. Juneteenth commemorates June 19th, 1865, when U.S. Army General Gordon Granger goes to Galveston, Texas, to announce the end of slavery in Texas. I think a lot of people think that, I mean, the story is that people didn't know and it had been kept a secret from them. But what really happened was that the Army of the Trans-Mississippi kept fighting. Most people think that when Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, that the war was over. But it wasn't over. They kept fighting. And so the Emancipation Proclamation had been made, 2.5 years before Juneteenth, but the US Army could not enforce it in places where they were not in control. That's right. They were not in control in the Southwest. So it's not a thing that enslaved people in Texas didn't know, because enslaved people tended to know everything white people knew. Not in terms of education and books, but think about news, about what's going on, because they were there with these people. They overheard stuff and they talked, and then they traveled to places. I mean, they knew. All right.
That's right.
But they couldn't do anything about it because the Army was still fighting. The Confederates surrender at the beginning of June. I think it's June 2nd. And then Granger gets his orders to go to Galveston and make this announcement. He goes there with Black troops who are there to liberate, to make this announcement. And some people say that he read the announcement. General Order Number 3 is the relevant document. That he read this out loud on a balcony. And some people say that the troops went around and read it. And it actually, the Galveston history says that they tacked a copy of it on the door of an African Methodist Episcopal church in Galveston. So both of those things could have happened, right? I mean, read it over the balcony, and because the more efficient thing to do would be to send the soldiers through the, through the city to say this. So that day, when he says slavery's over, he also says that, and now the former enslaved people would occupy a state of absolute equality, and that's the phrase he uses.
That's right.
With their former enslavers. He didn't say enslavers, he said masters, whatever. So though that language is read and people are jubilant, and there is evidence that, as I said, even before he got there, there were instances of Black men working on wharves who were celebrating, and people said, what are you celebrating about? Because we're going to be free. So even before he gets there, they know what he's going to say, what's going to happen, what happened. So the enslaved people are jubilant. The former enslavers and white people who may not have had any, enslaved people as property, were very resentful. And when I was doing my research for this, I found instances where people who celebrated were whipped for celebrating, but they celebrated nevertheless. And so every year, from 1866 on to today, Black Texans celebrated this day or commemorated this day. And in 1876, 4 Black men pooled their resources and bought land in Houston for the express purpose of holding Emancipation Day, which is what it was called then.
That's right.
Events. And I just think that's so important to think of people who are doing this under hostility, right? And they buy land so that they can, then they're going to keep doing it. And so they can do it and commemorate what had happened. I mean, so yeah, I mean, that's why we were celebrating this. And when I was a kid growing up, we remembered this. It's a day of remembrance is what it really is. I mean, there's a celebration part of it, but it's really about remembering the feelings of those people who found out that they would not be treated as property anymore. And with all the things that went with that, as you all know, I mean, as we all know, what enslaved people feared more than anything. It's not the whip was bad, working for no pay was bad, but separation from family.
That's right.
Somebody could come in and sell your children and sell your wife or husband, and so this is the day for, it's almost like a family reunion.
That's right. That's part of
everybody comes together. And so that's what it is. I mean, it's a long answer, but that's really what that day and the reaction to that and the resilience in the face of determination, in the face of a lot of hostility, to keep the memory of that day alive and to gather with family.
And just that one answer, you've really dispelled a number of myths about Juneteenth that many of us have learned. You've dispelled the myth that the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by itself ended slavery for so many people. And you showed that there needed to be a military presence, and African Americans had to take some initiative themselves. Yeah,
you're right. I mean, I meant to say that as well. Emancipation is a process, and enslaved people were voting with their feet. They were leaving.
That's right.
The plantations and, liberating themselves too. So that was a part of it, definitely.
That's right. And so when you talked about, again, when General Gordon Granger, he comes, there's Black troops with him. So Black people are playing a part for freedom on that end. They're in the Union military. Of course, they're also playing a part in the other end by escaping from slavery. So they are playing a part on both ends. And you also talked about, and I think it still exists, Emancipation Park. I think that's still a park.
Yeah, it's still a park. It's still a park in Houston. I've been there celebrating.
Wow. Yeah. So you have Black people having a park so that they can celebrate this. And that is not just about the end of slavery, although it's about that. It's about the reunification of family, because slavery was the destruction of families. And so Juneteenth, in celebrating the freedom, you're also celebrating the ability for families to be connected to one another once again.
That was so so important, and it remains important, because for people who didn't have anything else, at first it was the people in their lives, their families, their loved ones, who were everything to them. And this day allowed people to come together. And I do think that the point about the soldiers, the other thing I wanted to say is, it's not the end of slavery legally in the country. I mean, that doesn't happen until December, when the 13th Amendment is ratified. But what happens here is that the Confederate Army realizes that it has been defeated, and that military effort to hold people in bondage was crushed. And it was crushed in large measure because of the enlistment of Black troops who made, and Lincoln, people credited with, they knew that this was the reason the Union could be victorious. And so these are people fighting for their own freedom, and they are victorious when they win when the Confederates give up at the beginning of June, and then Granger can go in with the troops and then make this announcement.
The again, one of the other myths is that these were the last people to find out that they were free, and of course you've dispelled that myth. They knew. Black people generally knew everything that white people knew, because they were enslaved and in these places that white people were. So all discussions that were happening, there were Black people there. And so Black people knew, without Facebook, without Twitter, they knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, because we know that within the first 6 months of the Emancipation Proclamation, hundreds of thousands of Black people are escaping from slavery. And going from word of mouth. They hear about
Exactly. I mean, I don't think people think about what slavery was really like.
Right.
White people and Black people were in physical proximity to one another more in slavery.
That's right.
Probably than they are now. I mean, they lived, I mean, in the houses with one another, and they were with them all the time. And unless they were, I mean, it had some secret code, which they didn't have. And even if they had a secret code, they would have figured it out. They heard what was going on. They knew what was going on, and they had their ways of transmitting that information. It's just that you can't, I mean, issuing a piece of paper doesn't make things work. What made things work was military action, was force. And I think it's a source of pride for me, a point of pride, that there were Black soldiers who were involved in forcing this issue.
Tell us.
That's what we're commemorating.
Yeah, tell us more about that role of African Americans in the U.S. military, in the Union Army, especially in Texas.
Well, they come to Texas with Granger, and as you said, they escaped to join the Army. At first, there was reluctance to do this because there were all sort of notions about, well, could they be soldiers? What has slavery done to them? Would allow them to be good fighters. But after the first engagements, people knew that wasn't the case, that they could be good soldiers, and they won battles. Everybody knows about the Glory, the movie, and all of that. But they were part of the Army, and they were, as I said, they were fighting for their freedom. People say, well, it was about the Union, and that could have been it for white soldiers. And eventually some white soldiers got into the idea of ending slavery too. But there's no question what was the goal of Black people, and not just the soldiers, as you said, people running away and basically breaking the plantation system by not staying and escaping from it.
Yeah, one of the soldiers from the Michigan Regiment, the 102nd Michigan Colored Regiment, what he stated is, let the white folks fight for what they want and let us fight for what we want.
Yeah.
And so, and he's basically saying that we're fighting for something different than the bringing back of the country as a union together. That's not our purpose in this fight. Our purpose is something different. And of course, freedom is at the center of why Americans are fighting.
Exactly.
So now Texas was a battleground state on the issue of slavery before the Civil War. And there are issues regarding slavery and the indigenous people and border battles with Mexico. Tell us about the significance of Texas in the 1800s before the Civil War.
Okay. Well, it's funny. I talk in the book about how when people think of Texas, I say Texas is constructed as a white man.
Mhm.
That when you think about Texas is a white man, and you think about a cowboy, even though many of the cowboys were Black, we know that.
Right. That's
But the
right.
Hollywood version of it has them as white. Or you
That's
think
right.
about a cattle rancher or oilman, you think about the West Texas.
Mhm,
But West
mhm.
Texas is the least populous part of the state. East Texas is the more populous part of the state. And that area was founded by, at the beginning, a man named Stephen F. Austin, whose father got the right to bring settlers into Texas. He died before he could do it. And Stephen F. Austin, his son, took up the mantle. And so he was bringing people from Georgia and Alabama and places, slave states, into Texas to sort of extend the cotton empire. And he says, if people come here and we don't have slavery, they will be poor
Hmm.
for the rest, for a good part of their lives, because they wouldn't be able to make it make it well without that, without the institution. So the Mexican government, Texas is a part of Mexico at this point. The Mexican government wants these settlers to come because they want somebody to sort of work with them or to be on their side against the Comanche and other indigenous people that they're fighting over land, And so they welcome them. But what they don't like, they're not too keen on slavery. And Mexico outlaws slavery.
That's right.
They kind of look the other way about the Texans, or Texians as they were called, because, as I said, they wanted them there against the indigenous people. So they look the other way. But then the Texians were not secure. They thought, well, they could turn around and really crack down on this. And there were other issues as well. There are different cultures, different languages, but they feared the end of slavery. And so they decide that they're going to that they're going to leave Mexico. And there's a fight, and that's what the Alamo is part of that
Really,
fight,
that's
Battle of
part of
San
that fight.
Jacinto, all of those things. And they establish a republic in 1836, which is unabashedly a slaveholders' republic.
Wow.
The Constitution has numerous provisions that talk about slavery and race. They say basically, that slavery is protected here.
Mhm.
Black people can't become citizens here. Free Black people can't migrate here and live. And it's not, the American Constitution kind of tries to hide. He's talking about persons held to service.
Yeah.
This is out front.
Yeah.
And as you were intimating there, this made Texas controversial because this is 1836. The sectional crisis is heating up, and northern states they're afraid that if Texas becomes a republic, they will eventually want to become a part of the United States, which they did.
Mhm.
All along. I mean, many of the people who did that saw that as sort of a way station. Not
Mhm.
all people. Some people thought that they could make it as a republic, and others thought, well, this is a way for us to get annexed, and then we can become part of the United States, and we would have protection against Mexico because we'd have the forces of the United States behind us. But that was really controversial. A lot of people didn't want Texas in because that would upset the balance between free states and slave states. So that's Texas's history.
Mhm.
Now and so slavery is there. We're from the 1820s. They joined the Confederacy when people began to secede, and they fought to protect slavery twice, essentially,
Right. That's right.
against the Mexicans
Mhm.
and then against the United States of America. And
Wow.
they won one time, couldn't hold the republic because they didn't, bad management. Mexico really didn't accept this, and there are all kinds of problems. Some foreign nations were kind of looked askance at them because they were so open about slavery. So they failed, but in the end, they joined the Confederacy. Confederacy loses, and then they're pulled back in, and then Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow, and
Wow.
we're fighting. It's an amazing history. I
is.
think it's an
Wow.
amazing history.
Yeah, Texas is really, when you talk about Texas this way, it really tells us that it's an international story almost. It's not.
It is.
You're talking about more than one nation. You're talking about you know, at one point, you're talking about 3 separate countries. You're talking about Mexico, and then there's a Republic of Texas, and there's the United States. And in that milieu, in 1829, Mexico has Vicente Guerrero as the president. He's an Afro-Mexican, and he outlawed slavery. And then you have this history of Black people escaping, not just to the north on an underground railroad, but they're going to Mexico.
Oh yeah, that's where they went.
Texas is Mexico at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not trying to get to the Ohio River,
right?
It's getting beyond the Rio Grande and getting to Mexico. Yeah, it's the Six Flags over Texas. I talk about that in the book. You know, that's what it refers to. That the amusement park, Six Flags, and then what's that about? But it's the flags that flew over Texas.
Wow.
Where the amusement park was actually founded. And when I was a little girl, I went there about 3 years after it opened. And so it was Six Flags, you know, the Confederate flag, and they had little sections to sort of represent everything, even the Confederacy, you know, an area that was supposed to do that. So it is an international story. And that's what I wanted people to think of, not just white guys riding on the range. There is much more complicated than that.
I grew up going to Six Flags in Illinois and in Ohio, and never knew this history of Six Flags founding in Texas and the Six Flags, what it really represented until, of course, the book. But it's really awesome that this history is all around us. Yeah. We just don't notice it until someone points it out, that we're really being confronted with this history about slavery, this history about the Civil War, this history about freedom fighting. It's always around us, but we don't notice it until it's pointed out. And that's just a great thing that happens when you read the book. So those of you who get the book or check it out from your local library, when you do that, you're going to be able to see things that you noticed before, but didn't know what its significance, what its origin, how it's connected to this historical moment. You're going to learn that from the book. So that's a great thing. But along with this larger history, this international history, there's a more personal history that comes out in this book as well. You grew up in Texas, and your family has roots in Texas before the Civil War. Tell us about your family's heritage in Texas.
Well, my mother's side of the family, one line goes back to the 1820s in Texas, before Texas is a republic, while it's still a part of Mexico. My father's side of the family, the earliest I could get them back to was the 1860s. So it's a long time. And I would say most of my family is still in Texas. I mean, there are some families that went to, I was mentioning before that I had a cousin who went to Detroit. But for the most part, my family has remained in Texas. When they left their little towns, left the farms, they went to Houston, and they went to Dallas. They didn't go other places. So most of my family is still there. So the roots go back a long way, and they're still extensive there. And, you know, was working on this, when I was working on this book, I remembered that my great-grandmother had mentioned that my great-grandfather had worked in Galveston.
Wow.
They had a cotton farm, and he would go down to Galveston to work on the wharves, you know, after planting. And so he could make extra money working on the wharves. And it was fascinating to me when I was reading about the history of Galveston, and that there were Black men who worked on the docks in the late, 19th century. They had a union. I mean, all the kinds of things that people are doing that, you don't hear about. You've said before about the history that's around you. People were doing stuff in the middle of some really, really bad circumstances, trying to do the best they could under those circumstances. And I would actually like to be able to go back at some point and do more research about Black people in Galveston and to figure all of that out. But yeah, my family has been there for all these years. I was born in a town called Livingston. And then about 6 months later, my family moved to Conroe, Texas, where I grew up and until I went away to college. I had the experience of integrating the schools in my town when I was 6 years old.
Wow.
I was somebody said, you're like the Ruby Bridges of your little town. Yeah, it was sort of like that. I wasn't escorted by police officers. I mean, there were threats against my family, but I don't know that maybe they didn't think they were credible, but I didn't find that out until later on. But I had this very intense experience of being the only Black person in this institution until the court later on struck down, 3 years later, struck down. They had freedom of choice plans. That's why they were trying to get around Brown. This was 10 years after Brown. And white parents were supposed to pick white schools, and Black parents were supposed to pick Black schools. And my
So
parents—
it wasn't freedom of choice in the way we would.
No. I mean, that's one of those phrases people use when they really mean the opposite of that.
Okay.
You really don't have freedom of choice. But my parents decided to do this, and I think they were idealistic. Later on, they gave a more pragmatic reason for doing it, but I think they were idealistic. And they sent me, and I was there by myself for the first year. And then later, another girl, her parents sent her there. And then the year after that, the Supreme Court struck down freedom of choice plans, and everybody had to change schools. And so that created some consternation in the Black community, because Booker T. Washington, where my mother taught and where my older brothers went, was sort of the center of the town. You know, the teachers lived in the community. They socialized with parents. They knew they went to church together. And then they kind of, you know, they lost that because they had integration. I'm not romanticizing, you know, segregation.
Right.
But it was I mentioned this because I think my parents became a bit disillusioned. And that's why later on they said, well, we sent you to the school because we knew the court was going to strike down the plan and you would be in place. I think they might have been a little, I don't know if they were embarrassed or concerned about having been idealistic in the beginning about all of this. They integrated the schools, the children, they didn't integrate the teachers. So my mother remained in the classroom, but all throughout across the South, a lot of Black teachers were moved out of the classroom.
That's right.
So Black kids lost role models. White kids lost the opportunity to have Black teachers as role models.
That's right.
And that, you know, I think that there was, on my mother's part, you know, she said, I remember her saying to me one time, and she went to Spelman and TSU, and she said, I went to school to teach Black children. I mean, she loved her white students, and you know, that wasn't the question, but she was part of a generation of people who saw themselves as sort of like a vanguard. They were out, they were supposed to be, you know, you were supposed to be doing something to contribute to, you know, I guess uplift the race was the phrase that they used back in those days. And she couldn't fulfill that mission in the same way with integration, done the way it was done.
That's right.
And she became a minority in the faculty lounge.
Wow.
Instead of being with other Black women and, you know, some Black men too, who were teachers. They were Black, and the principal was a Black man. So it's sort of a bittersweet story.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a smooth, you know, just one clear march towards progress. There's some bumpiness in this history, because history is more complex than we sometimes tell it to be. Earlier, you stated about how you had family that was even in Galveston, and there were people who worked on the wharfs, there were cotton plantations. When we think of cotton, or at least many of us, when we think of cotton plantations during the antebellum years, or even after the Civil War, when we think of Mississippi, of course, even Louisiana, Georgia. Many of us don't think about Texas. You know, we think of cowboys and ranchers, like you said earlier. We don't think of cotton. And we may not even think of the docks. You know, we don't even think of that as a part of it. Tell us a little bit about Texas during Reconstruction, as Black people are supposed to have rights. After the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, you have soldiers occupying parts of the South. African Americans now gain the right to vote, they gain the right to run for office. What is Texas like during this time? We now know that there were cotton plantations there because you just told us. Black people working on docks. How does that look after slavery?
Well, okay, so I'll start by saying Texas is a big agricultural place. East Texas is wonderful farmland, even today, growing lots of crops and so forth. I mean, but cotton and sugarcane were the big crops, and everybody wanted to make a killing with cotton, obviously, because it was king. And indeed, my father's great grandfather, after they came out of slavery, they bought some land and they sold timber off of the land. That's how they made their living, because timber, because people think of Texas as the desert, but if you look at a map, a topographical map, you'll see the east part of it, you'll see green.
That's right.
And it's a big forest, essentially. It's called the Big Thicket. And so that's how my ancestors who came out of slavery on my father's side, that's how they supported themselves on their land, cutting timber, being essentially lumberjacks. That's what they were. So there's all kind of agricultural stuff going on in Texas. During Reconstruction, there are, as there were in other places, Black people who held office and did stuff and were part of the Republican Party, the old Republican Party.
That's right.
The 19th century Republican Party. The Democrats were the Klan, essentially. I don't want to say that they weren't all in the Klan, but you know what I mean.
Yes, that's right.
The Republicans were
outwardly white supremacists in most places in the South.
Exactly, that's what they were, and there was hope. One of the most moving things that I found was my great-great-grandfather on a voter registration list in 1867.
Wow.
And I just thought about this
the beginning of Reconstruction, right?
Yes, it's the very beginning. And I think of this person who's right up there, right at the front of the line. I mean, who wants to participate as a citizen. Wow. And a newly freed person who is gonna be a part of the American Republic, American polity, and that lasted until the end of Reconstruction. By the they pulled the troops out of the South in 1876, all over the South, and things slide backwards. There was a time when there was a hope on the part of Black people and some whites too, for a multiracial democracy, but that got shut down pretty quickly, pretty thoroughly, and Jim Crow comes back. And that's why I mentioned, I have a chapter about me integrating the schools to talk about my town in the mid 60s, where when I went to the doctor, there was a separate waiting room for Black people and one for white people. The one for Black people was tiny, and we very often had to stand outside because it was too full for people. And the white one was big and had lots of magazines, which I noticed. And when we went to the movie, we had to sit in the balcony. Just think about this. My father was a veteran. He'd gone to Korea. And to think of coming home and having to take your children to a separate waiting room, or, your kids going to the balcony. Now, they could have left, and I also often wonder about that. And I wonder why, what made the difference? Why did they stay?
Yeah.
And the only thing I can say is that maybe they didn't want to leave their land.
Okay.
They had,
that makes sense.
They had on my mother's side, they had, as I said, a cotton farm. And on my father's side, they had purchased, about a couple of 100 acres of land where they were cutting timber. And we still have some of that now. I'm still paying taxes on that now. And still, getting some timber off of it. Maybe they didn't want to leave their land. The idea of having that, it may, and I know that some people who had land left anyway, but they didn't go. And I never, to my regret, I never talked to them about, or to older people about, had you ever thought about leaving? Because when you're a kid, I'm not,
right.
I wasn't thinking about those kinds of things. But so thinking of a veteran having to live under those kinds of circumstances. And I think that's one of the reasons when the civil rights movement was going, he and my mother really wanted to try to do things themselves, on their own, to try to effectuate change.
So, as you just told us, you grew up in a Texas that was still a Jim Crow Texas. So it was, it was still a Jim Crow Texas. And some of the major battles about Jim Crow were fought in Texas. We know that as well. We know that McLaurin, in the fight about the University of Texas.
Yeah, and the white primaries.
The white primaries, Smith versus Allwright. So we know that there were these battles, these civil rights battles in Texas that dealt with Jim Crow. While you were growing up, did you I mean, you told us about going to the doctor, and did you notice, was it really blatant to you, the different kind of life you had under a Jim Crow system?
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned the magazines, but I'm talking, right. This is something that a kid would notice. It really bothered me, and it probably bothered me more than the fact that we had a smaller waiting room, is that they had lots of magazines. And I loved to read when I was a kid. And so that they had a nurse's station with a window that looked out into one waiting room and a window that looked out into the other. And so if you were standing, when you were settling the account or whatever, I could see into the other one. Wow. And I saw what it looked like, and I knew it was better than what we had. And yeah, I understood that. I also knew, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, there was a store that was sort of on the edge of the Black community. And the proprietor of the store, a white guy, was so nasty to Black people who came to his store to give him money, wow. To buy stuff. And we were told not to go there. But sometimes when I was a little kid, you just rush in and get some bubble gum or something like That's that. Right. And I just remember him being, looking at me with such hatred. And I knew I hadn't done anything to him. And so that you're thinking about, so I don't, how people have this nostalgia for mom and pop stores, and they say, Walmart has lots of problems. God knows. I mean, there are issues about wages and so forth. But those little stores, those little towns, they were mean to us. I don't have any nostalgia for that at all. So I guess what I'm saying is, early on, I understood that there was conflict between Black people and white people. I didn't understand why. When you're 6 or 7, it made no sense to me. Why is it a big deal that I'm going to school with white kids? Why is that why would that be a problem? What am I going to do that would cause a problem? I was a good student. I'm a pretty even-tempered person. What was going to do? So there was a puzzlement there. And I think that led me, maybe why I'm a historian, because I thought a lot about why. And once I began to think about slavery and realized that set people and how they responded to people of another color, then it became clear to me. But this is something that happens later, a realization that I have later. But it's very, kids are very conscious of being treated differently.
Wow, that's right.
They pay attention to stuff, and they're weighing stuff all the time. So yeah, I knew that there was a racial divide, and I knew that we were being treated worse because we were Black. And I will say this, I never thought in all of that there was anything wrong with me.
That's good. That's powerful.
I thought it was, what's the matter with these people? Because I know I haven't done anything.
That's good. That's powerful. So again, like you said earlier, when many of us think of Texas, we think of cowboys and Indians and ranchers and steer, or like me, Texas beef brisket. We think of those kinds of things. But after slavery, there's two states that have significant numbers of Black towns, all Black towns and freedmen's towns. Of course, Oklahoma has the most. Yeah. There's really a push at one point to make parts of Oklahoma an all Black state.
Yeah.
But Texas has probably the second most of these freedmen's towns. And it just is remarkable as African Americans are finding all these different ways to respond to oppression. So in some senses, they are fighting to be truly treated as equal with civil rights in the same society as whites. But another response is, well, we're not being treated equally. We're going to start our own town, our own community. And these are all just ways, I call it genius ways that African Americans, there's really no route that you can take that Black people haven't taken to try to deal with inequality in America, whether it was voting rights or segregation in public facilities, whether it's unequal schools. Black people have done all these different things to try to respond. And of course, even during slavery, there's people joining the Union Army. There's people doing that. There's people who are enslaved, who are burning the crops and escaping during the Civil War. So you got all of these different ways that African Americans have responded. And you see them all happening really in Texas. You see these lawsuits that were part of the NAACP's civil rights campaign to overturn segregation. You see people like you were, a young child, going to a integrated school system now, being the Ruby Bridges of your town. You see that way. And then you see all these all black towns. And then you see Black people who own their own land, like your forefathers, I think it was your great grandfather, owns his own land, own cotton farm, and people selling timber. It's just all these different ways that people are responding to oppression and inequality. And Texas is so large that you can see all of them happening in that one state.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is, when I was thinking about this time period, I'm very interested in that 1865 to 1900 period there, because as you're saying, people are doing all kinds of things. They're not, they're trying every avenue, and a lot of it depends on your personality. I mean, could be no one size fits all for how you tried, because everybody's circumstances would be different. But all of these people were trying to do stuff. And I really want to go back, having seen part of this, because I lived pretty much in the 18th century and, the Revolutionary period. But I really like to go back at this moment and start to think more about and investigate more of what people are doing, because they are doing these things in these towns. And that's right, to say, look, if we can't make it in these places with whites, we're going to get stuff on our own. But of course, as we saw in Tulsa, and this is not their own town, but their own area, when they do that and become successful, there's resentment there. So, it's a very, very, a story of a lot of oppression, a lot of hatred, a lot of, and perseverance in the face of all of that, which I find just amazing in a lot of ways, that people were doing these things, like I said, in unions and in organizations, running for office, doing kinds of things that in the face of people who really, hated them. I mean, I'm sure Foner's Reconstruction, the book about Reconstruction, and
that's right.
You remember some of the descriptions of the kind of violence that was meted out against the freed people. This person in Texas coming upon, in a town, coming upon about 30 bodies hanging from trees, men, women, and children. Once enslaved people were no longer valuable as property.
That's right.
I mean, their labor was important, but as capital, but as an item of property, wanton killing was not uncommon. And so, it's hard to imagine living, under those circumstances. I mean, we still have instances now where there's violence with impunity against African-American people. But looking at this information, looking at the things that I found, I just am in awe of people who kept going under those circumstances.
So I'm going to, we're coming to a close. I know it's going to be time for the question and answer period. So I'm really trying to put a few questions together. One is, or it's really more than one. One is that slavery is really central, and racial inequality and Jim Crow, they're really central to Texas's history. But Texas has been one of the states, one of the major states, probably the leading state, where school districts and the legislature have long fought to remove the teaching of this kind of history, the teaching about racism and slavery. Now, right now, there's a lot of states that are now getting into the act of trying to remove this history and outlaw teachers from teaching it. But Texas has been on that road for much longer. How do they teach the Alamo without teaching about slavery? How do they teach the Texas Constitution? I'm just wondering, first, how was it when you were at school? And I know, at one point, Booker T. Washington was the school for your town. But how was it when you were in school, and how is it any different now? How are they teaching this history of Texas, where slavery and racial inequality and Jim Crow is at the foundation of the history of Texas, without teaching that?
Yeah. Well, we didn't talk much about this when I was a kid. I think slavery was mentioned, but I don't recall, and maybe they said it, but I doubt it. I don't recall my teachers. We took Texas history twice, in the fourth grade and the seventh grade, and there was an elective you could take as in high school. I don't recall my teachers making much of a connection, or any connection, but certainly not much of a connection between the formation of the Texas Republic and slavery.
Wow.
I don't remember that.
Wow.
Mexico was an enemy, and they emphasized, as much as people do when they're talking about, when lost cause people are talking about the reasons for the Civil War, they emphasize federalism concerns. It's like, well, and Santa Anna did suspend the Constitution. And so, all right, he did do that. And there were language differences. So it could be that those two people were destined to move apart. But slavery was a big part of that, and the reason that they wanted to go. And that I didn't make that connection. I found that out as a teenager later on, reading on my own, essentially, to find this out. And I think what's happening now is that things have gotten better. I think what's going on is a reaction. The reason these people are reacting is because there are schools, there is more of a focus in schools on this kind of thing. If people weren't doing this, I don't think it would seem as urgent. This is sort of these are desperation moves in a way. I mean, I participate in a lot of over the years, I've participated in a number of teachers' institutes, where teachers come and we talk about lessons plans, and we talk about how to discuss slavery. We talk about all these kinds of things. And I've had people from Texas in these. So I know that there are people out there who are bringing this information to people. But I think what's going on in legislatures is a backlash against, just in society in general, and not just in the classroom, but in general, paying more attention to the issue of slavery, and seeing in a very defensive way, as if, you're saying that they are, the people today, they are the ones, that they are worthy enslavers. And we're saying, no, these are your ancestors. And you either have to repudiate that. If you repudiate that, then everything can be fine. You just say, well, they did those things and it was wrong. And now we're moving on. But they don't want to say they were wrong. And I think they feel attacked when tell the truth. But I'm not going to not talk about what happened to my ancestors because it makes other people uncomfortable.
That makes sense. And that's important. And so as my last question, before we move to questions and answers from the people who are participating and listening to us today, is that Juneteenth, and we're talking about Juneteenth on Juneteenth. We're talking about on Juneteenth, on Juneteenth. So as we're talking about Juneteenth on Juneteenth, and talking about your book on Juneteenth, Juneteenth becomes a state holiday in Texas before it became one anywhere else, which of course makes sense. But even that took over 100 years before it becomes a state holiday. Can you tell us about the process of how it became a state holiday, and how has Texas embraced it? We know that African Americans were celebrating it, but how has the state in general embraced the celebration of Juneteenth after it became a state holiday?
Well, I can only tell you what I know from looking at it afar. It became a state holiday officially in 1980, and I was spending most of my time in Hanover, New Hampshire at college. And so I know, and then went to law school. So I know from afar and from visits what it is. But even before then, when I grew up, it was just a Black Texan holiday as far as I knew. I don't know that white people celebrated it. But even before it became a state holiday, local news would cover the parade and picnics and gatherings and musical gatherings. And I could see white people in those gatherings sometimes as well. So I think even before it became a state holiday, the celebration of it spread out to more people. And I think it became somewhat fashionable, probably fashionable for whites to be a part of this. And, I don't want to put down anybody who sees themselves as an ally in these kinds of things, but it became much more widespread even before, it was more widespread, even before it became a state holiday. And from what I've seen, it has been embraced as a kind of Texas thing. And Texas people kind of get, you know, nostalgic and chauvinistic about things that are Texas-y.
That's right.
I mean, when I won the Pulitzer Prize, I got letters from the Republican senators from Texas, even though I didn't even live in Texas anymore. I mean, somebody on their staff knew that I had been from Texas. So if you put that in there,
right,
they're gonna, if you run the Texas flag up, Texans are gonna stand up and salute. So I think it's become a Texas kind of thing, and they do it in their own way.
That's great. That's great. Well, I want to thank you for such a wonderful conversation. And we've talked about the information in this book, and we've talked about the information around the history of Juneteenth and Texas's history and your own family history. And now we want to open it up for questions, but I guess I'm not running the questions. I know someone else is going to be taking care of the question and answer period, but I want to thank you. And I'm going to stick around, of course, to engage in the question and answer period. But I want to give you a hand for the book itself and for the discussion about the book.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this a lot. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right.
Okay.
Christine, take it away.
Okay. My first question is not a Juneteenth question, it's a Hemings question.
Okay.
When do you think your next book on the Hemings will come out? I just discovered I'm a Hemings and have lots of questions. I have most of your books, and this is from Francis Alexander.
Okay. Well, it's sort of somewhat delayed because I did a detour and wrote this book. So I'm thinking probably 2023 should be the date. If I can get back on track. I lost a day. I lost a year in the archives because of COVID. So we're looking 23, and that's optimistic, but it's definitely by 24. It will not be as long as the Hemingses of Monticello, but yeah, so I'm looking at 23, 24. Now that I can get back on track, now the archives are open again, and I can, it really is traveling. Now that when we are able to travel, I'll be able to go the places that I need to go to nail some things down.
Another question comes from our partner, Source Booksellers. Thank you, Professor Gordon-Reed, for your article on the neglected origin story of Black American in the June 2021 Atlantic magazine. Did the information from this article come from your research for this book? We are your biggest fans at Source Booksellers.
Oh, thank you. Well, yes, it did. It was actually an excerpt, a slightly altered excerpt from on Juneteenth, because I wanted to talk about the first known named Black person in Texas. And so I'm giving a history of Texas, and just to say it didn't start with plantation slavery, that there were people of African descent who were in that area with Spanish people. And just because they didn't speak English doesn't mean that we don't have a connection to them. And so it's a bid to sort of suggest that people of African descent all over the world have a connection because of, certainly in the so-called New World, because we were brought here, mostly because of slavery, and we've lived under white supremacy, whether we were speaking French or Spanish or English. And so I'm glad you like that, because I wanted to emphasize, I want people to think of that as an origin story too.
That's right.
And to make those connections whenever we can.
That's right. That's great.
Source Booksellers also put on in the chat, if people didn't see it, that they're giving away free copies of the audiobook today. And so I'm going to give their phone number. And their phone number is 313-832-1155. So you can call them, and unless Allison puts it in the chat, you can call them and she can tell you how she can give you a free copy of the audiobook.
Hey,
so
Allison.
I'll get a lot of yays for that.
Yay for that.
And listen, Pat Harris says this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you. Let's see. And she also said that, thank you so much for your books. Thank you for sharing your time and giving us honest history. And that came from
Very
Pat.
welcome.
And let's see, who else? Not a lot of questions, just a lot of people saying thank you and they enjoyed it.
Oh, that's good.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've had a good time.
And
Very good
I
questions.
do like that when we talk about origin stories, there's not an origin story, there's origin stories
Yes.
about, it's more than one. And so I like that part. So I did get to that on Juneteenth, that there's an origin story that relates to that part of what is now the United States of America. We're mostly been confronted with the 1619 part of the origin story of African Americans. And of course, 100 years before that, before 1619, in the 1520s, you have enslaved Africans in what is now a part of the United States, Puerto Rico.
Yes.
So in the Caribbean. So in the 1500s, you have enslaved people, and Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So that's another part of the
origin story.
It's more than one origin story. And I like the way that you put that in there. That lets us know that there's not this one line story starting at 1619 and then working its way to 2021. There's different stories, and all of them merge together. They're little creeks that run into one river. And as you stated, people living under white supremacy, in some cases under Spanish control, other cases under French control, other places under British control, and other places under Dutch control. And these rivers or these streams run together into creating what is now called, what was called the New World, but also the United States of America.
And I say it in the book. I mean, people of African descent were all over the world doing all kinds of things. And it's important for young people, I think in particular, to know that and to make that a part of their heritage, our heritage.
That's right.
Well, thanks again for visiting with us today at Detroit Public Library. The little bit of housekeeping I have is Allison said, please email her at Allison, and her name is spelled ALYSON .sourcebooksellers@gmail.com for the On Juneteenth book audiobook.
Okay.
And let's see, Leslie Williams said, thank you for presenting this on the first National Juneteenth holiday. And another bit of housekeeping is Jamon and I will be together again on Tuesday for a book titled Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, about the Detroit riots in 1943. So for those who attended this, you're more than welcome to attend that. You can go to, it'll be on Detroit Public Library's website to register or on Eventbrite. So thanks again, everyone.
I'm rushing off to another event.
She has both of them have
the Urban League, the Urban League of Chicago. Goodbye.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon-Reed.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jamon.
Thank you, Christine.
And
thank you, everyone.
One quick question. Didn't you get the, hold on, let me kind of end this. I probably just need to call you because I sent you, you have an email contract that you need to sign.
Yeah, but it's a problem when
so you can come to the library and do it in person.
So I'd rather come in and do it. Yep.
Yep. So just come see me on Monday.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep. Have a good one, everybody.
Goodbye.